I want to preface this video by just saying that we're not creating the disarray of the leaves, but rather just a base height that we can use as a simple generator to drag and drop in our future projects. And as always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you guys in future tutorials. Here's our little itty bitty graph. Here's what we're going to make. Let's get right on to it. But like usual, I want to go up to our new substance button here. We're going to get this little drop down, and I'm going to pick my new template. And if you don't have this, make sure to check out the video in the description below, and I'll show you how to create your own custom graph templates. And so we go up to our graph name here, and I named mine Easy Breezy because you can't stop me. And we just leave all of the other settings as they are. So now that we've got our graph set up, what I want to do is I just want to right click, drag and drop this guy into our 3D view, and he's just going to show up immediately on our mesh here. As well, I want to go up to our materials, go to default and edit, and I want to come over to where the scale is, and I want to bump that up to 10. And this is just going to show up our height map on our material. So in order to start, I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to start by adding a shape node. And I'm going to plug this guy into our normal and our height. As well, on our base material here, I want to come down, and I also want to expose the ambient occlusion. And so with that, I'm going to plug in our histogram range, and I'm just going to add an ambient occlusion node on top as well. So now that we're all set up, I'm going to come back to our shape. I'm going to go to our pattern, and I'm going to hit paraboloid. And you can see that we're just going to get a nice circular paraboloid shape. And I'm going to come down to the X on our size, and I'm going to shape this right down. And we'll go about 0.5. And actually, I want to change this from paraboloid to rigid bell. And that's going to give us a nice little split down the middle. And I want to bump this up now, actually, to something like, we'll go 0.6 instead. And that looks pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add a levels node onto this. And I just want to boost up the white levels a little bit to make a bit of a sharper edge. I'll bring the black up, and you can see what I mean now that we don't have a nice kind of hazy glow. I also want to bring down the white values a little bit to make it more of a uniform gray. I also just want to avoid any peaking, so I'm going to leave our white over there. So believe it or not, this is actually going to be the main shape of our leaf. And so what I want to do with this guy is I want to start adding some more leaf details or information to our texture here. So on top of our levels, I'm going to add a blend. I'm going to bring this over so we have some room to work with. And I'm going to start by adding a cells 1 node. And I'm going to plug this guy in. And you can see right now it's going to show up our cells. And so I want to mask off this blend to only where we have the leaf showing up. And so I'm going to take our levels here, and I'm going to plug this guy into the opacity. So we're going to use that as a mask. And I want to make sure that it is uniform across the entire leaf geometry here, and not kind of fading as it gets to the edges. So all we have to do here is I'm going to add a histogram scan node. If we take a look at this guy here, you can see once we move the position all the way up, we're just going to get a solid white outline, which we're going to use as our mask. And you can see now we're getting all of these cells showing up consistently across our texture. So now that I'm looking at these cells, I think they're a little bit too big for what our leaf is going to be. So I'm going to come up to our scale here, and I'm going to really bump these up. And I found that something like 170 is small enough to work with our leaves. And so it looks very, very small right now, but as we start adding more detail along our chain here, it's going to look more and more cohesive. I also want to warp these guys a little bit to distort them just a little bit more organically. And so I'm going to take this guy and run it through a directional warp. And I'm going to use the levels node that we used on our shape here. And I'm going to use that as kind of an indication as to where I want these cells to distort. And it's going to distort along the gradient of our texture here. And you can see that you can't really see too much of a difference. But as we bump this up to something like 85, you're going to see that we're starting to get the rigid bell shape in our texture for our cells. I also want to come to the warp angle and change that to 90 degrees. So we're going to get it kind of warping down our leaf texture, and it looks a little bit more like it's blending nicely with the geometry. And you can see in our mesh, it's going to do just that, where it's blending down towards the kind of stem area of our leaf. And now the last thing that I want to do is I want to invert these colors, because right now we have the whiter values as being the bumpy areas of our material, and I want to have those as more of divots and have these darker areas just kind of be the edges. So I'm going to take these guys back here, and I'm going to add an invert grayscale onto this. And you can see now that we're going to get more of a recessed and kind of divot-like looking effect. So now that we've got this detail or information for our blend here, I want to go into our opacity, and I'm going to decrease this heavily because I want it to be a very, very subtle effect. And right now it's a little bit difficult to see, so I'm going to come to our normal map. And I just want to bump this up to about 5 so we can see what's going on. And so I think that's still a little too noisy for me. I'm going to try 0.01. And I like that just gives us a little bit of information as to what's going on, but it's not too overbearing on our material. And now that we've got our cells out of the way, the next thing I want to do is start by creating kind of the pathways or the ribs of the leaf. And we're going to do that by creating a side chain here. So I'm going to start by creating a stripes node. And I'm going to come up here. And what I found works best is that we use our 2 stripes. We want to bring the width down to about 0.5 here. I want to make sure that we leave our softness on 0. And I'm going to bring our shift to 8. And so it doesn't look like too much now. I'm going to bring this guy into a blend with our chain here so we can see what we're doing as we progress with this side chain. So I'm going to take this guy and put him into the top here. I'm going to come over to multiply, and I want to bring this pretty low. And that's clearly not what we want, but we'll continue along and we'll see as we progress what it's going to do to our mesh here. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create a bevel because I want to soften these edges here. And I'm going to plug this guy into our blend because what a bevel is going to do is allow me to take these edges and I'm going to be able to kind of round them. And you can see with our smoothing here, it kind of blurs it and rounds the edges a little bit. And I want to bring this down to 0.1. And you can see now when I change the smoothing, we're going to have a little bit of a flat top here. But as we smooth it out, it becomes a lot rounded. And if we take a look at our material here, you can see it's not really doing too much. And we want to be able to affect both sides of our mesh here kind of symmetrically. And so what we have to do is we kind of have to mirror this bevel modifier or this bevel node here. So on top of that, I'm going to add a mirror grayscale, and I'm going to plug this in. And you can see immediately it's going to take our texture here and it's going to mirror it down the middle. And now we have a bunch of options where we can mirror it from, but I'm going to leave it on the X because that's going to cut down perfectly right where our texture cuts in half. And if I come and bring the opacity up a little bit, you can see that it's cutting down directly in the center, and we're getting the mirrored effect on both sides of our mesh. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to add some distortion to these waves here. And so I'm going to add a directional warp. I want to make sure to add a Gaussian noise. I love Gaussian noise. And it's going to give us a little bit of warp on our texture here. So we can play around with the intensity if we want a little bit more of an intense noise. We can again play around with the rotation. And I'm going to set this to 90 so that it sits perfectly down the middle of our texture here, our mesh. And I'm going to bring this up to something like 25. We can also play around with the scale to get different effects. And I'm going to set this down to something like 15. So it's not super noisy, but we can still see that there's something going on. And now I want this texture to start warping a little bit to our material like we did over here with our cells. And so I'm going to do the same exact thing where I take a directional warp. I'm going to come back here and take our initial levels node, and I'm going to bring this guy right into the input over here. And so you can see that we're not getting anything too drastic, but if we bump this up to around 45, you can see now our texture is starting to take significant emphasis on our warp. And so again, I want to bring this to 90 so that we start to get it down the middle here. And you can see it's got just a slight effect. And so now looking at our texture, it's still not exactly where I want it to be because our ribs are still kind of looking a little bit peculiar. And so what I want to do is I want to add a skew grayscale right before our mirror, because this is going to give us way more control over the direction that our ribs are going to take. And you can see here when I play around with this guy, we start to be able to kind of direct where they start to flow off from. And so because we're going to assume this is the bottom of our leaf here where the stem's going to be, I'm going to have our arrows angled this direction. So I'm going to settle on a negative 0.55. So now we can go ahead and group all of these guys together, and I'm going to call this ribs. We can also go back into our blend here and play around with the opacity to get a more subtle or intense looking effect. And so now we've completed the rib of our leaf, but now I want to go ahead and create a gradient. And then we're going to run that along the center of our leaf here so that we get a leaf that's kind of folding outwards along towards the edges. And so it's pretty simple. All we need to do is add a gradient axial reflected. And in order to use this node, you're going to have to make sure you grab 2018.2. You'll be able to get the same effect in any earlier versions than this, but it's going to require to use another gradient node, and you're going to have to use the mirror grayscale to kind of reflect it and get it to line up properly. So with our gradient axial reflected here, I'm going to make sure that we set our X to 0.25 and our Y to 0.5 so that we get it in the center and towards the left side here for this guy. And I want to make sure that the X for our 0.2 is 0.75. and our Y is going to be 0.5. And so this is going to give us a blend or a gradient right in the middle of our texture here. And so when I add a blend node, I'm going to plug this guy into our top. And now I want to make sure that I invert this because I want to take the darker value and blend it over top of our leaf here. And so I'm going to just invert grayscale. And I'm going to come to our blend and I'm going to go down to multiply. And so if we take a look here, you can see that we've taken the dark value from our gradient and blended it over top of our leaf to get a little bit of a blend of a gradient down the center. So we have a more recessed area on our leaf. However, that's a little too much. And so I'm going to bring the opacity down to about, let's see here, 0.75 should do. And I'm going to come back into our gradient here. And actually 0.3 and 0.7 work a lot nicer. And so now we've just completed our center gradient here. And I'm going to go ahead and just run this through in auto levels. And it's going to brighten everything up. So it's going to be a lot easier to see now on our material here. So with that, I want to go ahead and start creating some nice leaf veins, kind of like what we have here with our ribs, but I want it to run across kind of the panels of each of the ribs here. So again, I'm going to start with another stripes node. And I'm going to go up to our stripes and I want to type in 100 because we're going to have a lot of nice thin and fine veins running through. I want to have about 0.11 for their width, so they're going to be very, very small. I want to make sure that their softness as well is at around 0.85. And I want to make sure that I just leave their shift to 10. And now, like we did for our ribs, I want to add a skew modifier onto there just so that we have more control over the direction of our veins. And I'm actually going to set that to 0.7. It's going to be a slight turn, but as we directionally warp this texture here, it's going to make all the difference. I'm also going to add a mirror grayscale so that we have it going down both sides symmetrically of our leaf here. And now I'm going to directionally warp it. So I'm going to add a directional warp. I'm going to add another Gaussian noise. And when we take a look here, I only want to set the intensity to about 15. And we can also again play around with the scale to get different intensities as well. And I'm going to leave this at around, actually I'm going to leave that at about 40. That looks pretty good. Now lastly, I want to directionally warp this one more time. And again, I want to use the gradient of the leaf shape itself to determine where the actual warping is going to occur. And so for this, I'm now going to use our levels or our auto levels here because we also have these nice little stems or veins in our mesh, and it's going to help us kind of play around with our veins. I'm going to take this guy and plug him into the intensity, and I'm going to come into our directional warp here. And so I want to set our intensity relatively high, and I'm going to set it to about 85. So you're going to see that we're going to get our lines warping with our texture here. I also want to set this to a 90-degree angle, and now we're going to get some nice patterns kind of warping around in between each one of our little blends here, and it's going to look pretty gnarly. So now I'm going to set a blend node over here, plugging this guy into the top, and I'm going to take our auto levels here and plug them into the bottom. And then I'll plug these both into our outputs. So you can see what's going to kind of happen here is we're going to get a nice looking radial effect in each little panel of our leaf. But like we ran into initially, we're going to have some pattern kind of splitting over the sides here or spilling over the sides. So what I want to do is come back to our histogram range mask, And I'm just going to use this as a mask for our opacity. And when I plug that guy in, immediately we get rid of all the excess extra noise in the background. So now that we've got this masked off, what I want to do is I want to use these lighter values and I want to subtract those from our mesh. And so the way that we subtract lighter materials or lighter values from a value below is we use a subtract blending mode. And so now that's taken away from our material, but I still want it to be just kind of a subtle effect. And so I'm going to set our opacity right down to 0.01. So it's just barely visible. And you can see what it's going to do to our pattern here is we're going to get it kind of overlaying over top. And it's going to make our material look even that more realistic. And now that we've completed the veins for our leaf, I want to go ahead and start creating the stem. But before we do that, I want to move the leaf up a little bit. And I want to decrease the scale just so we have enough room to go ahead and create our stem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back all the way to where we have our first shape here. And I'm just going to bring the scale down to about 0.75. And it's going to make the leaf just a little bit smaller. And actually, I think we can bump it up to even 0.8. I'm going to come back here. And over top, I'm going to add a transformation 2D node. And so what we're going to be able to do with this is we're just going to take our shape and I want to move it up on the y-axis here. Just so that we have a lot of room when creating our stem. And so the next part is going to be a little bit tricky, and it's going to really just involve you following along with the values that I'm inputting in the nodes. And so the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and create an SVG node. And I'm going to go from new resource, and I'm just going to name this stem. I also want to come into its parameters and make sure it's set to grayscale so we get a nice black background. And from there, I'm going to create a shape extrude node. And so this node is new in Substance Designer 2018.2, and I'm probably going to cover it in more depth in its own separate tutorial. So for now, just kind of follow along with the values that I'm inputting. So we have an option with this shape extrude node for its profile type. And so with the profile type, I'm just going to come down and I'm going to hit mask. And so what this is going to allow us to do is we're going to be able to take our SVG node and plug this into the profile mask. And so anything that we create in the SVG node here is going to be able to then provide a shape to be extruded in our shape extrude. So with our SVG selected, I'm going to come up and make sure that we have the pen tool selected, and I want it to be set to path. And so we can think of this as basically where we're going to extrude our shape along the edge here. And I'm going to just start by drawing a very smooth and very thin shape along the edge here. And you can see that we're just getting a nice small vector along the edge. But when we go into our shape extrude, it's basically going to take this shape and extrude it along a 3D axis here. And we're just going to get a 3D shape that we can move around and manipulate in our extrude node. So now I have a couple values in our parameters here that work well for creating the leaf. And I'm just going to go ahead and kind of type them in and talk as I go. Again, this is all kind of playing around with your mesh or your material. But for our material here, I found these values are pretty specific. The first thing I'm going to do is change the extrude height to about 0.5, just to make it a little bit shorter. And I'm going to leave the extrude depth to 1. I'm going to come down to the extrude shape size, and I want to bring this down to something like 0.25 to make it a lot thinner. And I'm going to leave again the Y value at 1, so that we're getting a very oblong looking shape. I'm going to make sure I set the scale to 0.75. As well, I want to make sure that the bevel height is set to 0. I'm also going to bring the bevel intensity down. And I'm going to set the bevel curve to -0.7. And these are all just going to be subtle little effects that we're not really going to see too much on our actual mesh. I also want to come down to our downscale multiplier, and what this is going to do is basically downscale the resolution of our mesh here when we're exporting it, or basically plugging it into another node. So if I downscale this, you can see right here that we're taking a 2048 by 2048 texture and downscaling it half to a 1K texture. And if I do that by 2, we're going to get a 512 by 512. So while this node is going to be accepting 2K textures with our SVG, it's going to be outputting only 512 by 512. So as I zoom in here just to see what's going on, I want to make sure that we also set our X position to 0.5, so it's right down the center of our texture. And I also want to make sure that we set this to 0.05, just to get a little bit straighter. And so with that, we've created our base geometry for the stem. But now I kind of want to go in and bevel it, just so that it's a little bit more rounded and not just a flat grayscale image. I'm going to add a bevel node onto here. And I want to come in and I really want to decrease the distance to something very small like 0.001. And so we can see that it's not really done anything too drastic, just increase the value. But as we increase the smoothing, you can see the fall off that we're going to have. And it's a little bit more rounded as opposed to just a straight cut off. So now I'm going to blend these two together using a height blend, making sure to plug in our stem over top and our transformation in the bottom here. And I'm just going to plug these two in. Now if I take a look, I notice that we get a little bit of a shorter stem than we initially had. And so what I want to do with that is I just want to add another transformation onto our stem here. And I'm going to plug this guy in. And so now we can also use this to stretch the texture a little bit to make it a little bit longer as well. Now I want to come in and play with the height blend a little bit because I've noticed that it's a little bit too jutting out and it's not exactly like what a stem would look like. So I'm going to come in here and I want to make sure that the height offset is around 0.75 so that we get a little bit more stem going up our leaf. I also want to make sure that the contrast is 0.95 so that we get a little bit less of the kind of like the division between the two textures here. And so now the final thing that I want to do for our leaf is I want to start warping it so that it looks more organic and natural. So I'm going to add a warp node onto our blend. And I'm going to use a Gaussian noise to basically randomize our pattern here. And so immediately it's going to give us a very noisy result. So I want to go ahead and decrease the scale. And we'll go to about 10 there. We can also increase the intensity up to 2 and just find a nice kind of sweet spot for our blend. I'm going to probably do 1.5. And so the nice thing about our Gaussian noise here is that we can also play around with the disorder to give us different looking results. And that looks looking pretty cool. And so now the final thing that I want to do is I want to get rid of our base material here because we no longer need it. We also don't need most of these outputs, but we only need the height. So I'm going to take this guy, I'm going to plug him in over here. And I'm going to get rid of all of these other outputs. Because I only want the grayscale height value, I'm going to get rid of the normal and the ambient occlusion as well. And I'm going to bring the height over here. And I'm just going to plug this into our height output. And so now essentially what we've done is created a generator for our leaf. And if we go ahead and create a new graph, and I'm going to call this one test. If I click on our graph here and drag this in, we're going to get just a leaf generator that we can plug in to any graph that we want. Make sure to head to my Patreon where you're able to snag this generator for free. And as always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you guys in future tutorials.